Raising eyebrows and a new generation. Rosie the Riveter with renovations and always gets better with wine. Redesigning women, running the world while we're cleaning up the kitchen. Making bank, shaking hands, driving 80, trying to get home just to feed the baby. Skipping the bread for the butter, changing our minds like we change our hair color. Yeah, ever since the beginning, we've been redesigning women. Pulling up the floors and changing out the curtains. Some of us are saints and some of us are surgeons. Made in God's image, just a better version, and breaking every jello mold. And when we love someone, we take them to heaven. And if the shoe fits, we're gonna buy 11. How we get it done, we like to keep them guessing, but secretly we all know we're redesigning women, running the world while we're cleaning up the kitchen, making banks, shaking hands, driving 80, trying to get home just to feed the baby, skipping the bread for the butter, changing our minds like we change our hair color. Yeah, ever since the beginning, we've been redesigning women. How do we do it? How do we do it? Make it up as we go along. How do we do it? How do we do it? Halfway right and halfway wrong. Redesigning women, running the world while we're cleaning up the kitchen, making banks, shaking hands, driving 80, trying to get home just to feed the baby, skipping the bread for the butter, changing our minds like we change our hair color. Yeah, ever since the beginning, we've been redesigning women.
Okay, so good night, everyone. I hope you guys can hear me fine. Let me actually turn off the other computer. Good evening, everyone. I'm really, really happy that you guys are connected tonight with us. As of now, we have 43 people connected, and that means a lot for me. As some of you know, this webinar has been planned for, not the webinar, but this event has been planned for quite a long before, even before we announced to people, to the public. We have to cancel it many times. So I'm really happy that this is really happening at this point tonight. So, and I really think this is gonna bring a lot of new information to you guys. So I think everybody will benefit a lot from this. So if you don't know me, I would like to take a few minutes to introduce myself. My name is Juliana Ranches, and I'm assistant professor and beef cattle specialist at Oregon State University. And I'm based at the Eastern Oregon Research Agriculture Center in Burns. So at this point, you're probably wondering, is her last name really Ranches? And it is. And I think it's the most fitting last name for my position. And I'm really proud of it. So here at OSU, my job is split into research and extension. And with the extension, I'm glad to bring you guys tonight our program RancHER. So before I move to our speakers tonight, which are here, Vanessa and Fernanda, I would like to say a few points. I would like to acknowledge Oregon State University for the opportunity to put this webinar together, and the Women Given Circle for the support for this program. I also would like to say hi to Carla Sanford, one of our speakers for this event, coming up soon. And let me see if I have more people here to say. I was hoping that Susie would Oh, there she is. Hi, Susie. Thank you very much. Susie is a great friend from the Women Given Circle. So I really, really appreciate that you're here tonight to join us. Thank you very much for your support. If I miss anyone, I'll probably make sure to reiterate that later. So just a few housekeeping information before we move on. Questions, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the very bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat for questions, but it is better if you use the Q&A box, okay? That will make our life a little bit easier. And we will do, oops, I'm messing up here with the participants. Let me go back. And we will do questions as soon as the speakers are done. So when we will start with Fernanda, and we will address questions related to her presentation whenever she's done with her presentation. And same thing with Vanessa, we'll address questions related to her presentation whenever she's done. And then we'll revisit again at the end of the webinar to talk more about it. If you guys have any other questions, I also forget to introduce Gracia here is my grad student. So if you guys have any trouble with anything, you can shoot her a message too. She is here to help us. So one more thing I want to say before we begin is that we'll be drawing a prize of a gift card value of $100 at the end, the very end of the webinar. So you have to hang in there, looking at my face and our faces to the end to be part of this drawing. We'll do a draw every night, but if you connect every night, you have more chances to win our gift card. The way we'll do it, we'll just draw based on the list of participants that shows on my screen. Okay, so let me see. I do have a little script here to make sure I didn't miss anything. I don't think I missed anything. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Fernanda Ferreira that will be presenting Beef and Dairy, an overview of the strategy and thoughts for the future. Fernanda and I, we know each other for a very, very long time. We were actually roommates in Florida during grad school. So I'm really happy she's here today to share a little bit of her research with you guys. And I'm really happy she's here because she's definitely one of the bright scientists I know, and I do know a lot of those. So I'm really happy to accept our invitation. Thank you, Fernanda. So just as a background, Fernanda Ferreira is a cooperative extension specialist with USC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. Her field of expertise is herd health and management economics, focused on the economic outcomes of health and management strategies in dairy herds, such as selective dry cow therapy, use of in vitro embryo transfer during heat stress periods, use of beef semen on dairy as a reproductive and herd management strategy, which is basically what you will highlight tonight, because I think this has a major component for beef cattle producers. So we need to be aware what is going on. And I sneak peek her slides, and they're very, very nice. And Fernanda is like for me, she's from Brazil, and she has a very experience on agriculture from Brazil, as she does here. She worked in a lot of companies and agencies in Brazil, so she has a lot of experience. So she definitely knows what she's talking about, and I'm glad she's here tonight. So after Fernanda finished her PhD in 2010 from University of Florida, she joined the UC Davis faculty and works in applied projects at the UC Davis Veterinary Medicine Teaching and Research Center. Fernanda, thank you very much for being here tonight. And the screen is yours, so I'll mute myself and you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So good night, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen, make sure that I'll be able to do that correctly. Let me see. Can you all see my screen, the presentation mode?
Yes, Faye, you do. It's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So good night, everyone. First of all, it's a big pleasure to be here. As Juliana said, we've been not only colleagues in the same profession, but also friends for a long time. And I received a lot of good feedback about the event, about the programming. So congratulations, Juliana. This is amazing. Thank you for inviting me. So I will get started. So before I dive into, into the topic that I'll share with you today, I just want to share a story. So when Juliana contacted me and told me about the event, I was like, okay, great. I think it's awesome, but I work with dairy cows. So how can I contribute to, the audience of this webinar with information from the dairy world? And that's when she came up with the idea. She said, hey, what about the beef on dairy? I think it would be nice to provide an overview, what you guys are doing. There is a big discussion. This is a major management change that dairy farmers are doing, as I'll show you. And as I said, my idea here is to share the overall reasoning behind this strategy. And if you have any questions, please let me know at the end. I'll be glad to help, to answer and help you understand a little bit more about the dairy farmer's perspective. So Juliana has already introduced me, but I am a professor in cooperative extension. I work a lot with dairy farmers, not only in California, but elsewhere. This is a great collaborator that we have in Texas. I work a lot with technology. I work a lot with precision dairy, precision devices, looking both into ways to improve dairy farmers' management, but also the economic aspects of these things. And when I first came to California, I noticed this thing here. I noticed that farmers were really curious about the use of beef on dairy, which is basically using beef semen to inseminate some of their dairy cows. And the name that they were giving to this practice, it was to create a new profit center for their dairies. And that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. So basically, that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit, give you an idea of, the numbers that we're talking about, why beef on dairy, why dairy farmers are using beef semen, how this strategy works, what are they really doing here in California, and a look into the future, what we think based on market data that's going to happen looking forward. So let's get started with the numbers. So this article was published at the Hordes Dairyman magazine. For those of you, I bet you all know this magazine, but for those of you who are not familiar with this is one of the most important dairy magazines in the US and the world. And in 2019, that was the editorial article written by Corey, and it was beef on dairy semen sales skyrocketed in 2018. And this was basically using beef semen to inseminate dairy cows, or having a beef bull, to put on the cows that don't get pregnant. That's not new. But this huge increase in the use of beef semen was new, and it started in 2018. So just to give you a perspective, this graph is a little bit busy, but I hope I can navigate you through it. So here on the x-axis, we have the years, right? Here on the left y-axis, we have the units of dairy semen sold in the US in millions. And here on the right y-axis, we have the units of beef semen sold in the US for both industries. This is all together. Everything that is in blue is dairy semen. Everything that is in gold is beef semen. So if we look, there is, for instance, this curve up here is for Holstein semen. Of course, is the semen that is sold the most in the US, because that's the most dairy cows we have. We can see this drop, 2018. Same thing for other breeds of dairy. Same thing for Jersey, drop. Same thing for other dairy semen. I mean, we saw a slightly drop. The graph here doesn't show very well, but numerically there was a slightly drop, but not very intense. But when we look at the other, when we look at the beef semen, Angus and others, there was this huge spike after, 2017, 2018. And when we compare the sales, so from 2017 to 2019, there was a decrease in roughly 3.7 million units of dairy semen sold, and very similar to this increase in the beef semen sold. So we believe that the consumers of these beef semen, in fact, are the dairy farmers, and that's what we are seeing. So what we did, we went. So the dairy farmers, most of dairy farmers participate on a program it is the Dairy Herd Improvement Association program, and basically we have there a huge data set that contains both lactation information and reproductive information for cows that are participating in this program. So I evaluated the percentage of breedings. I look at all the breedings, more than 5.5 million breedings for those states, California, Idaho, New Mexico, Washington, and Oregon, from 2010 to 2018. And I wanted to understand the percentage of those breedings that were done with conventional semen, the dark blue, sexed semen, this gray, and beef semen. So as you can see, from 2017 to 2018, sexed semen was already high. Farmers have been using sexed semen for a variety of reasons that we're going to talk about later. But look at this increase in the percentage of breedings done with beef semen. So basically, the use of conventional semen is reducing. And even though that data was for the Western US, we saw this all over the US. This data was aggregated by Dr. Paul Frick, University of Wisconsin. This is data for Wisconsin. And the same thing here. We see the red decreasing, that's conventional semen. We see the blue increasing significantly, and that's the percentage of inseminations, that's the beef conventional semen. And we see this increase in the use of sexed semen too. So that's happening all over the US, and that we know too. So then, why beef on dairy, right? So the first thing that there are four main reasons why farmers started moving to use beef on dairy. The first one, and I'll show you, is the calf prices of the day-old crossbred calf, the heifer prices, the reproductive performance of the herd, and also as a tool for calf management and to improve longevity of their cows. The first thing, as I said, is the day-old calf price. So if you look at this graph is showing market prices from 2013 to 2020 of heifer calf in golden, the dairy bull calf in blue, and milk prices in gray. So the last good year for dairy farmers, for both milk prices and animal prices, was 2014. After that, I mean, during some periods a little bit better, others a little bit worse. But after that, as you can see, the day-old, for instance, Holstein calf or the Jersey calf has no value. The Holstein calf usually sold by $20, $30, which is very, very low. And same thing for the female heifers. So if the farmer has a surplus of heifer, they're not going to make any money with those heifers. And that kind of follows a little bit the milk price. And if you look at, let's say the farmer decides to raise those heifers all the way to first calving, and okay, now I'm going to sell this heifer. That's a bad strategy. Because as you can see, since 2014, the price of the top heifers, like very good heifers in the market, the price has fallen. And that's the value for May 2020, but I just checked, it's $1,400 right now. And that's how much they, on average, spend to raise this heifer all the way to first calving. So they won't do that, even though there is a farm that I work with and they needed cash for cash flow. And that's what they did. They were selling all the heifers and they were buying springers when it was time to replace the herd, which there's a bunch of other consequences associated with this strategy. But if we think purely about the economics, that would be smart to do. And the main drivers why this picked up after 2018. Well, from the dairy side, as I said, it was the low milk prices, the increase in the use of female sexed semen, and the low heifer and dairy bull calf prices. This increase in the use of female sexed semen is because we can improve by choosing which cows I'm going to put the sexed semen. I can choose really the genetic of my herd. And especially for heifers, you have lower reproductive problems because the female calf is smaller. Oops. And from the beef side, the cattle buyers, especially Tyson Food, quit buying Holstein steers in 2017. This was a market decision. There was a huge drop in the price of the beef, in the price of the hundredweight for Holstein steer, but the demand for beef continued, as we're going to see. So, you know, there was this opportunity. They did not want Holstein steers. So the farmers saw an opportunity to supply beef for these markets as well. And that's what I said. So they saw an opportunity to add a profit center to their herds and to manage their heifer inventory too, because they were producing a lot of heifers. And as I showed you, it was not economically interesting to continue to have the huge heifer inventory. All right, so how does this beef on dairy strategy work? So let's imagine that each dot in this graph is a cow in a dairy herd. And that actually, this is data from a dairy farm in the Central Valley of California. They have 3,300 lactating cows. And on the x-axis here, I have the age of the animal. So these are the, the heifers, maybe first lactation cows, second lactation cows, older cows. And this is the genomic net merit, which is basically, they did genomic testing for these cows, and they basically looked at, the average expected profit for that heifer compared to the average of the herd. So as you can see, which is normal, the younger animals, they are better genetically because, we've been improving those animals doing genetic selection. The older animals, they are slightly, on average, they are not as good as the heifers, but there are a few heifers that are worse than some of the older cows, right? So what the farmers do, the dairy farmers are doing, some of them split their herds like this. First, they calculate how many heifers they need to replace their herd, and then they split their herd and say, okay, on my heifers and maybe, some of my first and second lactating cows, I will put sexed dairy semen, and some of my old cows, I will put beef semen. I will inseminate them with beef semen. Others do it differently. Like in this case, they have the genomic information. They inseminate their heifers and their better cows with sexed dairy semen, and their bottom cows with beef semen. And of course, this is just a few strategies. They could choose to, maybe make embryos out of some of these best animals, but overall, that's what a commercial dairy farmer is doing right now. And since 2018, there has been a lot of economic analysis on this strategy. And I'm not going to overwhelm you with numbers here, but it's just to show you how profitable this is for the dairy farmer right now. Imagine that a farmer is not using beef semen. So, and let's imagine three types of farms, of dairy farms. One that has a very high reproductive performance, very good management. One that has the average reproductive performance. One that has a low reproductive performance. This is important because low reproductive performance means that more inseminations are needed to create the number of heifers that farm needs to replace the herd. So here, the high reproductive performance with less inseminations, they produce the number of heifers they need. And each column here is a different scenario. No sexed semen being used, using sexed semen in just a few cows. And as we go to the right, we increase the use of sexed semen. I'm not going to go into details because the idea here is to give you the overall idea behind this, the economics of these beef on dairy. Oops. Now, if we don't use beef as we increase the use of sexed semen, our availability of heifers, that's what this graph is showing, increases. So if I use more sexed semen, I have more heifers. And of course, the farms that have a better reproductive performance will always produce more heifers than the ones that have not so good reproductive performance. Now, let's take a look at the economics. So this is an index that's called income from calves over semen cost, which is basically how much money you make based on the value of the day-old calf minus everything you spend to make that calf. You're going to see that some values are negative because sometimes you spent more money to make that calf. You're going only to make that money back when that calf or heifer starts producing milk. But basically, imagine that this is for an average herd, average conception rate herd, about 20% conception rate. This is wrong, 20% pregnancy rate, sorry. So what we are seeing here is that the more each line is a percentage of use in beef semen. So this blue line here means that all the breedings that are not using sexed semen or conventional semen are using beef semen. So in this case here, no sexed semen means that all the breedings are using beef semen. In this case here, it means that, you know, some breedings are using sexed semen, all the others are using beef semen. This one here is just using no beef semen. This gray here is using 50% beef semen, 50% conventional, out of the ones that are using sexed, you know. So basically, the idea here is, as I move to the right, I'm using less beef semen. And as I move up, I'm using more beef semen. So as you can see, if I use a lot of beef semen here or here, I'm making more money. That's the overall idea of this graph. And when I look at the number of heifers that are produced, as I use less beef semen, I produce more heifers. So let's also be realistic and think that farmers do not want to go to the market to buy heifers. This is the exception. They want to produce their own heifers, and whatever is left, then they can play around with those breedings. When we think about that, and that's what I'm saying, let's just investigate these scenarios here a little bit further. Again, I'm not going to overwhelm you with all these values, but what I want to give you the insight here is that one of the important things that makes this strategy profitable for dairy farmers is the difference in price between the crossbred day-old calf and the crossbred day-old calf and the Holstein male calf. So the biggest, the greatest this difference, the more interesting is to use beef semen. So that's the first take-home message here. And then these authors, that's what they did. And that's why we know that, because they varied this price. And as they varied this price for both herds in medium reproductive performance or high reproductive performance, the strategy or the most profitable strategy changed. So for instance, when the difference here is very small, if you are in a medium reproductive performance herd, you should not use beef semen. So that's a very important take-home message. Then they varied other things. They varied the price of the heifers. They varied the price of the dairy heifer, and they equal the prices of the Holstein male and the crossbred day-old calf to see what would happen. They varied just what if, you know, the price of the day-old Holstein male is high. They also said, okay, what if we basically change here, something moved here. Okay, so what if we basically change, you know, the semen cost? What is going to happen? And again, the take-home message here is the most important thing. You can vary everything, but the most important thing that will dictate if it's economically feasible for a farmer to use beef semen or not is the difference in price between the dairy, the day-old, mostly the male calf, and the day-old crossbred calf. And that's basically the take-home message that I just shared with you. Okay, now when we asked farmers across California how much they were receiving, because that's what we were wondering, we said, okay, if that's so important, we need to know how much they're being paid for these day-old crossbred calf. And this graph here is showing for the pure Holstein herds, we asked, for instance, which beef semen you're using. Oh, we're using Angus. Okay, so what is the price of the day-old crossbred calf that you're receiving? And as you can see, based on this variation of colors here, it's all over the place. Minority is receiving less than $50. Some are receiving, between $150 and $20. Others are receiving more than $250. And now this big carnival of colors here, the take-home message is, regardless of the breed of your cows, and regardless of the beef semen that you use the most, there is a huge variation in the price of this day-old dairy beef crossbred calf that's being paid to dairy farmers. And that's a big red flag, because they may be actually thinking that they're making money. There may be better options for them other than using the beef semen. And the variation is a lot of times because of the beef sire that they used, the breed of the herd, and crossbred calf characteristics. Okay, so what are dairy farmers doing? So to answer this question, move this here. To answer this question, we actually surveyed, we look at data, as I said, and we surveyed dairy farmers across California. So the first thing that we saw is what I showed you, that there's this huge increase in the use both of beef semen and in the use of sexed semen. They're trying to get away from conventional semen. And the farmers that I talked to and I asked, why are you still using conventional semen? They say, oh, we know we're losing an opportunity, but sometimes their reproductive performance is not so good. And then they don't want to spend, because sexed semen is a more expensive semen. And the reproductive performance is lower. So then they're like, oh, we don't want to spend that money. We still want to try on that cow, but without spending all that money that we would spend buying sexed semen. And as you can see in the Holstein herds, this increase, especially in the use of sexed and beef semen, was huge. And in the Jersey herds, because we don't have recent data for beef semen, I wrote this here, limitation in data, but our perception is that there is a huge increase too. Less than Holstein, because the crossbred Jersey beef has less value on average than the Holstein beef. And as I said, we surveyed dairy farmers across California. As we can see, from basically all counties we have dairy farms in California. And now I'm going to show this here. The idea here with these numbers is to tell you that we had a huge range in terms of dairy size, in terms of milk production, and in terms of breed. Holstein was the most representative, the best. That's because we have many more Holstein herds in California. So we basically captured the practices of all types of dairy farmers all across California. In California, here's where the large dairies are. Here's more organic pasture-based dairy. So that's an important point too. We saw that 80% of the dairy farmers are using beef semen. And they have the vast majority started using beef semen in the last 3 years. When we asked them what is the percentage of their animals, of their herd that's being bred with beef semen, the vast majority responded, more than 30% responded that at least a third of their cows are receiving beef semen. We also saw that the most popular breed, regardless of the breed of the dairy herd, is Angus. Jersey herds, because they're still experiment what type of crossbred the market would accept. They're still using, they're varying a little bit more in the breeds, the beef breeds that they are using. One question that we asked them, and I think maybe this is an important point, especially for the beef audience here, we asked them, okay, how are you choosing the beef semen that you're using? Because this animal, this crossbred, is going to be beef, is going to enter the beef supply chain. The vast majority, 36% said calf range, which means that whoever they have a contract, an agreement with a calf range that custom raise those calves, you know, the bottle feed those calves. The calf range tells them which sire they should buy the semen. However, 32% said cost. And this is a big issue, not only for the dairy farmers themselves, because of the reproductive performance of their, because even though they're using beef semen, the most important thing for the dairy farmers is to keep the reproductive performance of their cows. They have to be high. And we don't know, you know, the effects of this semen here, especially if it's chosen based on cost. Also, because we don't know the quality, we don't even know how this crossbred would perform in the feedlot in terms of, you know, beef quality. So this was a big concern here. Other aspects are, you know, carcass characteristics, calving ease, which is a big issue, especially for Jersey herds. So they were concerned about that as well. We also asked, you know, which cows are receiving what type of semen, and we saw that the most common way to select which cows are going to receive beef is that the repeat breeders, the ones that don't get pregnant, third, fourth breeding, they put beef semen. Also lactation numbers, so old cows receive beef semen, and then they get a little bit more sophisticated here, looking at milk production. If they do genomic testing, they choose based on the genetic merit of those cows. We also saw that 78% of the farmers are using sexed semen. Among those, 82% is using beef semen. So the conclusion is the use of both sexed and beef semen as a breeding strategy for dairy herds is a reality. And we surveyed those guys in the beginning of 2020. So if I was to repeat the same survey right now, I would say that we would see even a greater percentage of farmers doing that. And this is just the same information about the day-old crossbred price shown in a different way. But what we see here is that the majority of the herds are receiving a price between $150 and $200. And if we think that the price of the day-old, both the heifer and the Holstein male, the Jersey, the value is zero. If we think that the price of these pure dairy calves is like between $20 and $50, the difference, which we call the premium, would be $100 to $150, and that is very high. So that guarantees the use of beef semen. Finally, we asked them, you know, what is the main advantage that you see when using beef semen? As we were expecting extra profit, to manage the number of heifers, and to facilitate the management of the genetic improvement of their herds. And we also asked them, remember, this was beginning of 2020. We asked them, what do you think is going to happen with the price of the day-old crossbred calf? The vast majority said it would decrease. 26% said the same. Then some of them said, we don't know. Very few said this practice would increase. This was beginning of 2020. Now let's take a look at the future. So in 2019, there was this article, very important article, that was published on drovers, that the authors discuss why is that so important for dairy farmers to be careful about what semen they use, because, and that they point out a few things here. They said, okay, we have to be careful to not oversupply the beef cattle market. We have to look for consistent carcasses. And as you can see, there's a lot of research that's still needed here. We need to understand quality. You know, maybe packers would turn away from this strategy. And a note here, participating on the round table, there was some guys from JBS there. and they were saying that they really like the crossbred calves. What they don't like, it's because they don't have a standard like the Holstein steer. So when it comes to, you know, fit the cuts into boxes and the logistics, that adds a layer of complication to them. So that's something that they're looking for. And the feeders might not capture the premium paid to the dairy farmers for these day-old crossbred calves. And there was this projection that was made at the end of 2019, what would happen with both the calf crop and the beef cow number. As you can see, they were projecting this slightly decrease, into 2021 all the way to 2027. And this is from the beef side. So that's beef production, not beef coming from the dairy world, I would say. And when we look at the real data for 2021, both for beef cow inventory and calf crop, we saw that pretty much is what they predicted. That's what they predicted is what happened. So there is this decline in beef cow inventory and in calf crop. When we look at the beef production, on the other hand, we see that, you know, this is projected for 2021, but we see this, it's not increasing a whole lot, but we see this consistent, you know, beef production with consistent beef exports. The authors, I did not show it here, but they also projected slightly increase over time in the exports, but very slightly, but, you know, it's not going to decrease. That's an important point. And what it's also important to understand here is that even though the per capita consumption in the US of beef is going down a little bit, and that's the projection, the population is increasing. You know, so, and also the population that we sell these beef to. So ultimately, we are talking about higher demand. And because of that, because of historical low or steady beef production, lower, you know, calf crops, we're talking about expected increases in beef price. And finally, just to wrap up this, I want to show two calculations that we did that I think it's a common concern among beef producers. So first is, okay, beef producers are very concerned what's going to happen to, you know, our calf prices if this thing continues over time. So without beef on dairy, without this strategy, this is what happens. The dairy world or the dairy industry has always been a supplier of beef. Approximately 20%, they estimated 20% of the beef in the US comes from dairy. And we basically did some calculations here, assuming that 94, that's the dairy herd in the US, 9.4 million dairy cows, you know, approximately 10% will receive sexed semen because that's historically what they have been using. So it was left to use beef, 8.5 million cows. Some of them will never produce an offspring because they will be cool, they will never get pregnant. And then these cows will be bred with conventional semen. This conventional semen, usually 52% is the outcome of is male calves. So that means we are basically talking about 3.5 million Holstein steer. That's approximately 27 million fed cattle that's being supplied to the beef chain. And that's approximately 13% of the US fed cattle supply, if no beef semen is being used at all. Now, we did the same simulation. We had to do a little bit of assumptions because we don't really know how many cows are receiving beef semen, but based on our numbers, we extrapolated those numbers. We did the same calculations, and we saw that approximately we're likely going to increase the dairy participation, but we are talking about 15% of the US fed cattle supply. It's not a huge increase. So we do not believe that this strategy will, you know, affect the beef markets. However, our main concern when we work with the farmers is to make sure, because I work with the dairy farmers, so the main concern is first that they're choosing the right semen to keep the good reproductive performance of their herd and to avoid calving problems, and two, to make sure that they are producing a good product that will be acceptable by the beef industry, and that will keep this market hot for them, because that's a good source of income for the dairy farmers. With that said, the take-home message of this presentation today is that the breeding strategy is determined by the market, and dairy farmers should be aware of that. Under current market conditions, of course, this is on average, the use of beef semen is warranted. For some farmers, they should be doing these calculations, and depending on the price they're receiving, they should not be using beef semen. Herds with high reproductive performance, they are benefiting more because they have more opportunities to use beef. That's a good opportunity to improve cow longevity, which has been an objective of dairy farmers for quite a while. And crossbred quality may be a differential for premium, and we think that this is going to be even more important as we learn more about these crossbred calves. Finally, I would like to acknowledge first my student, Jessica. Jessica did an amazing work. She collected data for more than 1,000, as you can see here, more than 1,000 crossbred calves. She's processing that data, looking into a lot of, incidence of disease, transfer of passive immune, transfer of IgG from the cows to those calves, performance of those calves, and hopefully she will follow those calves all the way to the slaughter. I also would like to thank Bill from Agritech, who provided us with the data, and of course, Juliana, for inviting me to present this data to you tonight. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Fer. Thank you very much. I think the presentation was awesome. I really think that beef and dairy is a subject that we still, on the beef side, need to learn a little bit more about. This was definitely very informational for me. Guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat. There's some stuff here, but not the chat or the Q&A box questions. I do have a few questions here, Faye. I have my own questions, so I'll go ahead and ask you. You just mentioned at the very end that you and Jessica are working on the project looking at the performance, basically, and health parameters of those cross-bred calves. So do you have anything that you can share right now? Do you have anything analyzed, or do you have, what's their expectation for that study? I think would be very nice.
That's a good question, because our concern, and this has been a concern for the dairy industry for a long time, and we know that based on a bunch of surveys, there's a lot of data published on this topic. We know that the male hosting calves, they usually are not as well managed as the heifers. And one concern that we had is because we know that the way we raise those calves in the dairy industry is completely different from the way the beef calves are raised with their mothers. It's a completely different setup. Everything is different. So we really wanted to understand how these initial management could affect the performance of these animals, in the feedlot later, if it would be different from the hosting steer. So we started collecting data from both hosting Angus and Jersey Charolais. Those are the crossbreds that we had from multiple dairies. And the first thing that we learned, and another hypothesis that we had, is that because these calves are much more valuable, maybe the management would be better at the dairy farm, the colostrum management, but that was not true. It was still bad, compared to the heifers. We did not evaluate heifers, but compared to what we saw in the literature, what we saw overall, of course, even though we had data from multiple calves from multiple dairies. It was only done in one calf range. These need to be repeated, probably an observational study, a survey study. But that's the first lesson that we learned. So we also believe that there is a lot of extension work that needs to be done to improve the management of these crossbred calves, because they are more valuable animals. The second thing that we learned is that the incidence of disease is basically the same. We were also concerned because these calves are they're being fed and managed exactly the same way the Holstein heifers and the Holstein male calves are managed. However, they grow faster, they're bigger, they're completely different. So we don't have we have not analyzed the weight gain data yet, but she's working on that, because another thing that we want to do, that was a question that dairy farmers asked us. It was like, okay, should I sell this day-old calf, or should I retain ownership of this day-old calf and sell them, right before they go to the feedlot when they're 400 pounds? But we didn't have the data to simulate, to create economic scenarios. So we had to go there, collect weight gain. That would be interesting as well. But we think that this is a big issue too, and we don't know. We have fingers crossed that we're going to be able to collect that data all the way to the slaughter of these animals, looking at carcass quality. Pedro is helping us with that. But we believe that that's also a huge point to investigate, how the initial management of those calves is affecting the carcass quality and the performance of those animals later on.
Thank you, Faye. I just saw that Pedro is connected here too, so maybe for next editions of RancHER, we can invite Pedro, but he will have to wear a wig. I do have a few more questions. So I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit about how fast and maybe how the supply of crossbred can change and can impact the beef demand.
Yeah, I don't think, it's hard to say.
Is there a wave or anything like that that we should worry about? Like we're gonna have a boom of those calves in the market, something like that?
Yeah, so based on everything, I've been reading about, I'm not an expert in beef markets at all. So I understand the dairy markets, I understand, the dairy price and how it fluctuates. But based on everything I've been reading, there is not, in the forecasting, there is nothing saying that there will be a huge drop in prices because of an oversupply of crossbred calves from the dairy industry. So that's one thing. The other thing maybe, and then I as I said, I'm not the expert to discuss, beef price or beef markets, but one thing that is important, as I said, is the price of this day-old calf. So let's say something happens let's say we have a foreign policy problem, and one of our main buyers, which is the Middle East, they stop buying from us for whatever reason. Mexico, Middle East, China, Singapore, they stop buying from us. Let's say this happens. The breedings that are being done in the dairy industry, they're done. So 9 months from now, those calves will be on the floor. And then 9 months from now, the farmer will have to decide which strategy they're going to do. So that's why a lot of farmers, what they're doing, they have an agreement with the calf range. So the calf range guarantees that they're going to buy those calves by a certain price. So I think that's an important point too. Most of the farmers, some don't, they just sell those calves to, they call people, hey, I have this extra calves, do you want to buy? They sell those calves to, a little bit here, a little bit there. So I honestly don't think there will be a huge problem in terms of prices because of these beef on dairy.
Okay, thank you, Faye. We do have a question on the Q&A if you want to address that one.
Oops, let me open here.
And you can probably, if you have the option to do answer live, if you can click on that and repeat the question.
Okay, so Agatha asked a good question, and this is actually the subject of a lot of research that's being done on the beef side. So she asked, is there a beef breed that when used on dairy would be more suitable for the packing plant? So from the beef side of things, what researchers are doing, and these researchers working all the way through the supply chain, calf range, feedlot, and then packing, meaning mostly, I would say, beef quality, and of course, having those animals, more equal because that helps them. So they're looking to a variety of breeds. They're not only breed, because breed is important, but not only breed, but the sire within breed. So they're selecting a few sires that are more suitable to be used on dairy cows because the product will be a better product for the beef industry. Some companies, ABS has one. All these big companies, they have what they call, it's a sort of beef on dairy bull that they sometimes there's not for instance, I don't know if it's ABS, I may say something wrong here, but one of these companies, they have those sires, and they're not pure Angus, they're cross, and they know that those animals are the best animals, both in terms of reproductive performance, calving ease, and also the performance in the feedlot and the carcass quality. So they're looking to that. There's a lot of research and a lot of data being collected. I think you're mute, Drew.
Oops, sorry. We do have one more questions on the Q&A, but I would like to move, and if you don't mind, answer that, typing your answer on that line. I would appreciate, so we don't hold here. So I just want to thank you again, and I hope you stick with us to the end of the discussion. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker. We're going to shift the gears a little bit, and we're going to get more into the wildlife and how that affects grazing. It's with a great pleasure that I introduce Vanessa Schroeder. I have a hard time saying your last name, even though we are colleagues. She's always out the end of the hallway. One day I'll get it good. So Vanessa will be presenting the potential effects of cattle grazing and weather on wildlife in sagebrush country. So like I mentioned, like me, Vanessa, it's based here at the URC in Burns. She's a faculty research assistant for Oregon State University Extension Service since 2016. But she's been part of the ERC team since 2013. So she's been on this ground for a long time. She knows a lot. So last year, Vanessa defended her master's in wildlife science from OSU, and I attended her defense, and she did an excellent job. I was very, very impressed with her work. So that's one of the reasons why I invited her to share a little bit of her research during her master's. And on her research program, she specialized in rangeland ecology to support wildlife habitat, spending about half of her time on stakeholder-driven applied research projects, and the other half advanced education and outreach programs around sagebrush ecosystems management and education, develop management solutions for degraded and threatened stage steps. With that, Vanessa, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Sure, sounds good. I'll just do a sound check. I had to switch to my phone due to rural internet issues. Do I sound okay to you?
Yeah, you sound fine.
Okay, perfect.
And we can see your screen fine too.
Okay, let me just make sure I can share sound. All right. Okay, well, thank you very much, Juliana and Fernanda. Yeah. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you very much for that. And I'm very happy to be the number 2 presenter for this wonderful series today. So as Juliana mentioned, my name is Vanessa Schroeder. I am a senior faculty research assistant and with OSU since 2016. I really was hired to work at that intersection of wildlife and ranching in our Eastern Oregon rangelands. So I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different than Fernanda, but hopefully equally interesting to all of you. I'm going to be sharing preliminary unpublished results really about the potential effects of cattle grazing and weather on wildlife in sagebrush country. So I do want to acknowledge my amazing collaborators and co-authors listed here on this slide. I really couldn't do what I do without them. And if you do want to follow this project, other projects from my team, and just kind of interesting tidbits in and around sagebrush country, you can follow us at the different social medias at Sage Habitat Team. And I'd be really remiss if I didn't mention my funders. So this project has primarily been funded by the Bureau of Land Management with additional funding and support from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Oregon Beef Council. So thank you all. Okay, so it sounds like some of you are familiar with sagebrush country, but some might be from further afield. And so I like to start with just a little bit of background about the sagebrush species. I've heard it called Oregon's outback, the sagebrush steppe, the sagebrush ecosystem. There are really many different names for the high desert sagebrush ecosystem. So I'm guessing that many of you actually work in sagebrush country, so you're very familiar. But those of you who don't, maybe you've at least driven through Eastern Oregon and seen what might appear to be just this constant, unchanging sea of sagebrush. So I've heard people say, it looks like the moon. There's just nothing out there. All it is sage. And to me, that really couldn't be further from the truth, because within the sea of sagebrush, it's really an incredibly diverse ecosystem. It has a wide variety of plants and animals, and I just kind of want to share that with you. So an example, some plants. I'm a rangeland ecologist. I like my plants, especially the bunch grasses we have. They come in all different shapes, sizes, forms, great for wildlife, great for grazing. We also have different shrubs. It's not all sagebrush out there. We also have bitterbrush that's pictured right there in the center, rabbitbrush that's down below. Bitterbrush is really good browse for some of our wildlife. And then we have our wildflowers. So if you've been in sagebrush country in the spring, especially in a wet year, you know that we have a lot of really neat wildflowers. So those are going to be the forbs. So that diversity in plants, that actually translates to also a diversity in a lot of different wildlife species. So actually hundreds of species call the sagebrush sea home. Many are pictured here that you're going to find if you wander around sagebrush country. There's also all of those usual critters of snakes and reptiles as well. But unfortunately, the sagebrush ecosystem is actually one of the most imperiled ecosystems in North America. And it's not going to be any news to those of you who work here, but it's facing unprecedented landscape scale threats. And so this would include large scale increases in wildfire, encroachment by junipers, and invasion by annual grasses. This has actually resulted in it shrinking by over 50% compared to its historic range. And so one of those big culprits is wildfire. So wildfire has increased in both size and frequency throughout the decades. So that short little animation of all those different blobs on the map showing up, those are decadal fire parameters. So each color represents a different decade. And you can see now at the end of it, there's a lot of fire on the landscape. A lot of those shapes overlap. So more areas are burning, and a lot of areas are burning over and over again. So extreme weather resulting from climate change, it actually interacts with these threats, and it's driving these more frequent, more intense wildfires. And we're getting these mega wildfires over hundreds of thousands of acres, as anyone paying attention to the news the last year is well aware. So changes in weather and fire frequency, they're also fueling the expansion of annual grasses. So these annual grasses are invaders to the ecosystem. And many of you are probably all too familiar with our cheatgrass, our Medusa head, and maybe even our ventnata. So these annual grasses, they're increasing, and in turn, they're actually fueling the frequency of wildfires. So you can see from this map, the more red it is, that means there's more annual cover. And unfortunately, there's a lot of red on this map. So our sagebrush rangelands, they're actually continuing to convert to invasive annual grasslands, and that's no good for anyone. And then the third large landscape scale threat I'm going to talk about is woody encroachment into sagebrush ecosystems. This is primarily juniper in the northern Great Basin. So it's further shrinking the sagebrush ecosystem for all of the different users. So this, the wildlife and plants that really call the sagebrush sea home, they're really being squeezed on all different sides from all of these different threats. And so habitat's continuing to shrink. So this has really raised alarm bells, right? This extensive loss of habitat, it has led to declines in sagebrush obligate wildlife populations. So you're probably really familiar with that bird right in the center if you're out west. So that's the greater sage grouse. And I pictured it right in the middle because it's really been a hot topic out here for many years now, partly because it is a sagebrush obligate bird. That means it relies on sagebrush to survive. But you might be less familiar with all these birds circled in white. So these are also sagebrush obligate birds. We have the brewer sparrow on the bottom left, the sage thrasher down here in the center, and the top right is the sagebrush sparrow. And they rely on sagebrush to actually reproduce each spring. So we're partly interested in these species because they are the sagebrush obligate birds, much like sage grouse. One really big difference is that sage grouse, they live in the sage completely year round, even through the winter. Our songbirds, they migrate south for the winter, but they still do require sagebrush to survive as a species because it's of course, is their breeding ground. And these maps, kind of the takeaway for you is that their ranges do overlap. So all three of these maps, they have sage grouse range in blue on top, and then you can see the range of the songbirds underneath. So on the left is sage thrasher in this kind of brownish color. You can see there's a lot of overlap. They have a broader range. Sagebrush sparrows are in the center with that purpley color. They don't overlap quite as much, and our sagebrush sparrows are actually species of conservation concern. They're harder to find throughout the landscape, and they have slightly different range, but still a lot of overlap. And then our brewer sparrows in this pinkish color, they're much more widespread than our sage grouse, but a lot of similarities there as well. And so it has been mentioned that due to the similarities of these ranges of these species and the specific habitat requirements that they have, that they might respond to threats as well as changes in management in a similar manner. So while this is likely true of those really large-scale threats that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, it might be much less likely to be true of other landscape scale practices, such as grazing, that might be on a smaller spatial scale for these species. Okay, so before we kind of dive into the research, most people aren't very familiar with these birds at all. So I like to take a little bit of time and just get you more familiar with them. So I used to work in restoration, work with seedlings for our native grasses. And I spent a lot of time on my hands and knees counting blades of grass out in rangelands in sagebrush country. And if you'd asked me how quiet is the high desert, I would have said incredibly quiet. You can hear a pin drop. There's almost no noise. And while that's true compared to a lot of places, say like cities, it's actually pretty far from the truth in terms of the spring. So I didn't actually hear all of the birds and all of the sounds around me until I stopped and actually listened. So of course, this is technology, so we'll see if this works, but I'm gonna share the sound of a couple of these birds. So Juliana, give me a thumbs up if you can hear it. So that's the sage thrasher. It can keep singing for 22 minutes straight. We also have the sagebrush sparrow that are a little less common. Okay, so that was the brewer sparrow that many of you might actually mistake for a cricket. I know I definitely did when I was first learning these birds. So, great, a little bit more background. So brewer sparrow, I think it's kind of fun to learn a few different facts. That they're actually North America's smallest bird. Many people, they just call these birds the little brown birds of the sagebrush sea. And it pretty is nondescript. The brewer's sparrow is kind of a little brown bird, as you can see here. But it's pretty evolved to the sagebrush system. It can actually go weeks without drinking. And it's not super long-lived. It's the oldest bird is 5 years and 2 months that we've ever recorded. But interestingly, very different from sage grouse, they nest off of the ground, almost always in sagebrush, you know, typically higher than a lot of the grasses that might be grazed. What you heard was part of the long song that they have, which just goes on and on. It's for mate finding. They also have a short song for territory defense. They're big insect eaters. And interestingly, the adults, if it gets really, really hot, they'll stand over their nest and they'll fan their wings to cool off the chicks. So these birds, they lay 2 to 5 eggs, is what their nests look like. So you can poke your head in some sagebrush when you're out there next spring, see if you can find any. The nestlings stay in the nest for 7 to 10 days. Adults are on the eggs for 10 to 12 days, and they build a new nest every time. So it takes 4 to 5 days to build their first nest, and whether or not they were successful or failed, they typically re-nest at least a second time throughout the season. And that second nest only takes like 2 days to build. They're also monogamous, and the males actually really help out a lot on the nest. So they help incubate the eggs and raise the chicks. So way to go, brewer sparrows. Then we have sagebrush sparrows. They're much larger bodied. They're also one of the little brown birds, but you can see they have this gray head and a white chest with a little black spot. They're longer lived. So their oldest birds recorded 9 years old. They have what we call high site fidelity, meaning that they always come back to the same location to breed. That's not very true with brewer sparrows. So you might see changes in numbers at a certain site. For brewer sparrows, they might be going somewhere else. For sagebrush sparrows, it's probably the true population changing. They also have really variable nest placement. They might put their nest way up in a shrub. It might be on the ground. It might actually be in the grass next to a shrub, and it could be a totally different species. It might be low sage or something else. And what's funny about these birds is they run around on the ground with their tail up, flicking. And I say chipmunk-like because several times I've had to do a double take because I think it's a rodent that's running by me, not a bird. So it's pretty unique. They are the species of conservation concern throughout Oregon, and they're not nearly as common as the thrashers and the brewer sparrows. They're actually a lot more rare to find. So Oregon State has a lot of research projects with these birds going on throughout Eastern Oregon. This is the only study that actually finds these birds in any high numbers. And so because of that, they are a really understudied species, which could be a big concern if folks are looking to alter management. We would like to have some science before you change management. So for sagebrush sparrows, this is what their nests look like. More drab for the eggs. They lay 1 to 4 eggs, and they arrive at the breeding grounds already paired up, which is kind of interesting and unique for birds. They're also monogamous, although unlike the brewer sparrows, the females do have to do most of the work. The males will help out occasionally, but not nearly as much. Adults also sometimes lead predators, or us, if we're looking for nests, away from the nest. They'll kind of harass you and lead you away. And they're way more secretive and much better at hiding their nests than brewer sparrows. And part of that is they're running around on the ground, so you can't actually follow them back to the nest very easily. They're very secretive. And they can nest in grasses and other shrub species. So a lot of background there. Why grazing, right? I thought this was a grazing talk, right? So while grazing is not one of the primary threats to the sagebrush ecosystem, it is the primary land use on public and private land. And so this is just a map of beef cow density by county. These are gross numbers, so it's not adjusted by anything. But you can see in Harney County, where the study is located, there are almost 60,000 cows. And cattle grazing is really the predominant land use out west, including in the Northern Great Basin. So you can see that's roughly where that yellow circle is-ish. And if I haven't convinced you it's important, it's very important economically. I don't think everyone realizes that this is big business, very important to our state. So hay and cattle together, if you look at these two numbers, that's about $1.3 billion annually. So very important for our state. But grazing, unfortunately, has been indicated as a potential concern for sagebrush obligate birds. So, and unfortunately, sagebrush obligate songbirds are actually declining, especially those sagebrush sparrows. And a lot of this actually has to do with habitat degradation or destruction. So think back to those landscape scale threats that I mentioned before, the invasive annual grasses, the fire, and the juniper encroachment. But because grazing is a primary land use, it's thought of a lot in terms of changing management. And it actually can modify habitat in a variety of different ways. So there is potential for grazing management to change in order to meet wildlife habitat objectives, maybe for these birds, maybe for the sage grouse, or maybe to facilitate the management of the primary threats like fire or weeds. But grazing can modify songbird habitat through a reduction in herbaceous cover, kind of the obvious, right? Cows eat grass, which could change the visual obscurity, potentially affecting nest success. Especially for brewer sparrows that nest higher up in the shrub, that might not be the most likely mechanism. So less obvious habitat modifications, that might include how cattle affect the songbird predator community or the insects that they rely on to raise their chicks. And so while grazing is really important and widespread land use, it's not the only modifier of habitat in the Great Basin. So weather in the Northern Great Basin, it's incredibly variable, and it's likely a driver of nest success. And so this graph, it's just showing the extreme variability in precipitation each year. So on the y-axis is crop year precipitation in inches, and those two orange lines, they're roughly the long-term average. And you can see on average, we rarely see an average year. It's like total scattershot there, right? All over the place, all the way from barely over 4 inches to 22 inches. That's just the high desert. And so like grazing, weather can also interact to affect the songbird predator community potentially, or the insects that they rely on. So how are we assessing grazing on these birds? We conducted a replicated grazing experiment where we tested a no grazing control, dormant season grazing, and rotational spring defer grazing, all at moderate intensity. And so the gray boxes here, they represent the breeding season during which we collected data. And the data I'm gonna present to you, it's really just 2017 to 2019. We have 2 more years worth of data, but I'm not going to present that on that today. So in 2017, you see it's a different colored box. That's because we decided to start our treatment with defer grazing, meaning defer until after seed set for after the breeding season. That way we could have a pre-treatment data collected in 2017 before we actually applied any of the grazing treatment. And so 2017 was that pre-treatment year, as well as the application of treatment after data collection. And I say moderate grazing. You guys can ask me more about this later because I don't have time in this presentation, but people quantify grazing in all sorts of different ways. We went with the landscape appearance method because that's what Bureau of Land Management uses. It's a visual metric. It can cover the ground that we needed to cover. Some people do say it's a little bit more conservative of the metrics than others. And so our study site location is at the Northern Great Basin experimental range. You can barely see that kind of star in the top corner of Harney County there. And our study consisted of 3 blocks. Each contained, which essentially just clusters, each of those were containing 3 different treatments. And we assigned those treatments randomly to our 9 different pastures, the 15 to 20 acre pastures. So we had dormant season in green, control, no grazing in blue, and that rotational spring, summer grazing in burnt orange. And that rotational means 1 year it was grazed in the spring, the next year it was in the summer. So each of our blocks, the treatments were immediately adjacent to each other. They were only separated by a barbed wire fence, but there is spatial separation in between the blocks. Okay, so we all know grazing is important because it's a very important land use on our private and public lands. We specifically started this study to actually fill knowledge gaps that exist surrounding changes to management and sagebrush obligate wildlife. And so our goal is really to provide that science-based knowledge to help agencies and landowners make more informed management decisions. And so there could be potential for grazing management to change in order to meet wildlife or sage grouse habitat objectives and to facilitate the management of those primary threats I talked about. So this could include altering the number of cows, the duration or season of grazing. We can't change all of those, so we're just focusing on 2 different seasons of grazing. So I'm actually going to start with a summary of what we found and then go into details. I am not going to go into the effects of grazing on the plant community today. But I do want to say that we did actually see a treatment effect from our cows. So the cows did eat the grass, and we did see a change in herbaceous cover. So right now, this is focusing really on the nest success, and it tells us what factors played a role in determining how likely nests were to survive. So these included weather. Sorry, my puppy's barking back there. So the different effects that influence nest success would be weather, so precipitation and temperature, vegetation. We wanted to test for researcher bias as well from cameras that we placed on the nest. However, we did find that each songbird species was different. While sagebrush sparrows were influenced by precipitation and temperature and vegetation in the pasture, brewer sparrows were only influenced by precipitation. And while we know that the cattle did reduce that vegetative cover, right now at the 3-year mark, so 2 years post-treatment, for our grazing hypotheses, we can't actually say yet if there is an effect. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more later. So we know there's a lot going on out there in terms of what influences whether or not birds are successful when nesting. So it's really helpful to try to capture all of this and account for it before testing a specific hypothesis, such as grazing. It's actually incredibly important to try to do this. This is especially true if before we're testing a specific hypothesis, such as grazing, if we don't expect it to be a really big effect, or that we think that one of these variables might influence or interact with what we're testing. So for example, we want to make sure that if nest success just crashes and we have a big decline post-treatment, we want to know is that because it was just a really bad weather year? Maybe there was no food, maybe there was no resources. We want to be able to try to gather that information. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is actually this predictive model where we mush everything together, try to predict, and then test the hypothesis on top of that. And also we picked areas that we knew or thought to be really good habitat for these songbird species. So we weren't actually expecting to find much in terms of vegetation. We know that if sites with a lot of juniper, a lot of weeds, that wouldn't do very much for our birds. So we're actually not, we're not expecting to see that here because this is all good habitat without weeds or junipers or anything like that. So quick note, I'm going to show you some graphs. But they can be really confusing if you don't know what daily survival rate is. So we found nests in the field and we monitored them in person every couple days. We also put cameras on them to help track if they were successful. And we put these little temperature loggers inside of the nest and right outside. So then we could detect if the nests were cold and then therefore empty. So we called the nest successful if one nestling fledged from the nest, one little bird jumped out. But importantly, what does daily survival rate mean? This is what all my y-axes are going to be. So if you're not familiar with nest success analyses, daily survival rate is just the likelihood that a nest survives one day. I'm going to call it nest success because that's easier. But nest success is actually that daily survival rate raised to the number of days the nest was active. So for sagebrush sparrow, on average, that's 23. The reason I want to point all this out is because if you have like a high daily survival rate, let's say 0.98, the overall nest success over those 23 days is going to be about 63%. Now, if you're looking at that graph, look for small changes. Well, 88%, that doesn't seem like a huge change, right? When you raise it to the 23rd power, it's actually 5% nest success. So small changes in the y-axis can mean big deals for nest success. So starting with our brewer sparrow, what we found is that weather did influence their nest success. So this is just a graph of precipitation. So it's cumulative precipitation in millimeters over a 10-day period. And so what we found is they were pretty okay under most of the precipitation ranges, but right around this 30 millimeters, about 1.2 inches, if you get that much, which is quite a bit for us in the high desert in a 10-day time frame, their nest success really starts to decrease. So, right, you're probably wondering what this weird picture is there. So we had a very cold, wet spring one of the years during the study, and my crew and I kind of felt a lot like this really cold, wet rabbit that we captured on one of our game cameras as we slept through the sagebrush looking for these nests. And when I look at this graph, I kind of imagine that under these higher precipitation amounts, those baby songbirds, they might have been feeling a similar way as to the rabbit. So the other thing we found for brewer sparrow was vegetation. So we looked at vegetation at the pasture level and at the nest. For brewer sparrow, they didn't really care about the pasture level. It was only at the nest. And for them, we found that nesting higher in the shrub meant better survival. And so on the right is actually an example of a nest in a shrub. So I wonder if any of you can see it right away. Right there. So it's hard to see scale, but that's about a foot-ish off the ground. By comparison, here's a sagebrush sparrow nest. So they're much closer to the ground. This is a ground level camera. The nest is right there, and they have all different sorts of forbs and grasses in the way as well. So switching to sagebrush sparrow for the weather, there were some really complicated weather relationships going on here. So temperature and precipitation, they're interacting and they're doing some really interesting things. I don't want to show you a 3D graph of these results. It's really complicated. If you're really interested in that type of thing and you want to play around with it, you can use that QR code on your phone and play with it and see the actual graph. But for those of you who aren't super geeky about data, I'm just going to give you the highlights. So essentially, nests performed poorly when it was really hot and really dry. So we're talking like max temps over 86 degrees Fahrenheit and very little precipitation. So over a 5-day period, less than ½ an inch. So you can think drought, crispy rangelands. But interestingly, they also performed poorly when it was rainy and temperate. So kind of what you would think is pretty good days. So that's between temperatures of 54 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit and over about an inch of precipitation in the 5 days. So this might be because the adults, maybe they thought it was warm enough to leave the nest and to go forage. Maybe their movement going on and off the nest attracted predators, or maybe the adults just misjudged and the wet conditions were just too much for the eggs or chicks. But on the flip side, we found that nests with chicks were successful was kind of in this intermediate range, so of precipitation, regardless of temperature. So if precipitation was between 0.4 and 1 inch, they were pretty much always successful. Hot and wet seemed to be fine. Very cold and dry was okay. And that temperate and dry was okay. Really, the worst time was the very hot and dry. Rainy and temperate wasn't great, but hot and dry was pretty much the worst. So for vegetation, we found that unlike brewer sparrow, first of all, they nest differently, right? They can nest on the ground. They can nest in a low sagebrush, which is pictured here on the right. And that's a different species from our common big sagebrush. And so these shrubs, like their names, are very low to the ground. And it turns out when you have a high density of these shrubs in the pasture, the sagebrush sparrows in the pasture, the whole pasture, didn't do well. So this x-axis is kind of hard to visualize. It's the number of low sage plants per meter squared. I like to maybe think about it as per 100 meters squared. So imagine if you're going to take 50 strides through the desert with your arms outstretched, essentially 2 meters, right? As you walk that 50 meters, on the left side of the axis, you might find 1 low sage plant, whereas you might count 28 on the far side. So the more plants, that low sage plants we have in a pasture, the worse that they do. So we didn't find enough nests in these shrubs to actually know if it was because they were nesting in the shrubs and they weren't doing well, or it could be that there's just something different about these sites. Maybe they don't have the resources, they're rockier, there's something going on that makes it worse for the birds. Okay, so that's all my predictive models and variables that I'm going to talk about today, but you probably came here for the grazing hypotheses. I think it's really important to note a lot of what we've learned so far is that assessing grazing can be really complicated in these environments. And we did have several challenges and really complicating factors in this study. And so we did collect pre-treatment data in 2017. And it's really good that we did, because even though these pastures looked very similar to us in terms of plants and everything like that, there ended up being pre-treatment differences. So the sites that we randomly assigned to be controls before we did any treatment, they started out higher than the nests that were slated to be grazed. So this means that randomly, before we ever applied any treatment, there was just something weird going on in the 3 of our control sites. Maybe it was vegetation or insects or predators or different nest numbers that just made those locations more successful than the ones that we planned to graze. And this effect actually lasted through the entire study. So if we hadn't collected pre-treatment data, this may have actually looked like a grazing treatment effect if we hadn't known. So when possible, a lesson learned is always collect pre-treatment data. But we also found year differences. You can see here. So 2017, that pre-treatment year, it also had higher nest survival. Maybe it was weather. It just did, all the nests across all the treatments did better that year. 2018 and 2019 are lumped as post-treatment. They weren't very good years. So the pre-treatment year was just better across all treatments, including the control. And you have to be really careful here because some people might read this and incorrectly interpret this as a negative grazing effect, because the nest survival on sites that were grazed, they did go down, but they also went down in the controls. And so we saw a decline pretty much across all the different pastures in the study. And we also don't get to pick where the birds lay their nests. And unfortunately, they didn't do it evenly. So we also have differences in nest numbers, which would be differences in sample sizes across our treatments, pastures, years, and also throughout the nesting season. So this is why it's really important to develop that predictive model. Even though we're really interested in that grazing, we needed to test all of those other variables before testing our grazing hypotheses. And so here you can see that pre-treatment, post-treatment, the difference in those bars, that probably has to do with weather, right? So we want to try to capture weather. And the difference in those sites before treatment between those grazed and control, that could be vegetation, right? And since we didn't start with everything equal, we really have to make sure we account for what's going on to cause this different variation. Because if we don't do so appropriately, it might actually influence what we see regarding the grazing effects. And so that's why we go through rigorous peer review, which we're doing now, and make sure that our stats are super robust to deal with all these messy challenges. So that's a really long-winded way of telling you that we're not seeing a clear detectable effect right now. So now that we've accounted for all those challenges on the prior slide, we're finding that with just 3 years of data, we're not getting a clear, strong grazing effect. We probably have the precision. If there was a really strong effect, that we would have detected it. We do have to be careful because this doesn't mean there is no effect. There might be maybe a small effect that we haven't been able to detect yet. We don't have enough replicates or enough data yet. We do have 2 more years of data that we are going to be analyzing. So we might be able to pick up on those soon. And that's through 2021. But really big take home here is that we've learned that weather is actually particularly difficult to model without any biases. And so this is actually because weather changes within years and also across years. And so this is a problem that nests that fail end up failing disproportionately earlier or later in the season, or disproportionately across years that are hotter or colder. So for those of you who are familiar with the grass height, stubble height, temporal bias, stuff you might have heard about with sage grouse research, it's totally the same idea. So we're just making sure that we're dealing with all of that before we make any grand claims about the effects of grazing on wildlife. And what we learned is if you don't account for weather at all, or if you account for it in different ways, the effect of grazing actually comes out differently. And so this means we really need to be thinking critically about all grazing and wildlife studies that might show a slight or a moderate effect, and be sure that the effect actually is a true effect, and it's not due to some other confounding factors, particularly weather. So at the 3-year mark, the jury's still out on some aspects. We're pretty sure there's not some strong grazing effect, whether that be in the positive or negative, because we would have detected that, but it's out on a mild effect. So essentially, to summarize, for both species, we did find that we had a positive researcher bias with the cameras placed on the nest. They had higher nest success. And for both species, too much precipitation can end up being deadly. But for sagebrush sparrow, it's a little bit different in that temperature matters, and it actually mediates that effect of precipitation. And hot and dry conditions were the worst, but that wet and hot, not so bad. We also found that when sagebrush sparrows nested in pastures with that higher density of low sagebrush, those low sage sites, for some reason, those nests across the pasture just fared worse. And brewer sparrow, they were a little bit different. There was no clear temperature effect, but nesting higher in the shrub did prove to be a more successful strategy for them. But the takeaway, so if you're going to take anything home from this talk, kind of there in bold, weather, site, and year, we're finding are better predictors of nest success when compared to grazing. And so I always like to say, well, how does this apply to management? So we're finding that these birds, they're really well adapted to the high desert, especially the brewer sparrow, which seems to be pretty resilient to a lot of the weather it experienced. But increased periods of drought could be a major concern for our sagebrush sparrow, especially if our climate trends are leading to more variable, hot, and dry conditions, more droughty, right? But in the terms of management, we can't control weather, right? And so people always jump towards what we can control, such as grazing. So the main take home I have personally from this work, which is still ongoing, is that we're not seeing a huge effect from grazing. To me, we don't need to be overly concerned about grazing in these high quality habitats, right? There is no cause for alarm here. However, I will say that these are high quality habitats. We have, this could be totally different in habitats that have those threats expressed that I talked about earlier. Areas that are starting to be invaded by junipers, areas that are starting to be invaded by weeds. It could grazing could end up influencing the birds in those areas completely differently. So we can't say anything about those. But in my opinion, the best thing that we can do for all of the critters of the range is to really protect what we do have and prevent our future habitat loss. So that means we really need to get a handle on those mega wildfires. We need to reduce the weeds, and we need to keep junipers from taking over our rangelands, because that definitely is going to be good for these birds, and it's going to be good for the herds. So I think I just have a couple minutes left, and so I'm just going to touch really quickly on future work. So it hasn't been fully analyzed yet, but as I mentioned earlier, I don't think that we're having a really strong effect of grazing. But if we do pick up on a slight or moderate effect of grazing, positive or negative later on, especially with the brewer sparrow, I don't think it's really going to have a whole lot to do with that grass height or grass cover. I think it might have something to do with a different mechanism, potentially grazing influencing the different predator species. And so that's kind of what I'm theorizing here, is that maybe grazing affects the predators. And so this is a part of the study, the research, that we've collected all of this data and we just haven't analyzed it yet, but I think it's pretty interesting. And so research in other systems, they tell us that grazing can actually decrease the activity or numbers of potential nest predators, whether that be badgers or rodents such as ground squirrels or snakes, although that work hasn't been done in sagebrush country. And there's several reasons why grazing could affect predators that prey on the nest. So for example, cows eating grass, that could really reduce food resources, or maybe screening cover actually for rodents, altering their foraging, or maybe causing them to avoid their own predators in the sky, right? The different raptors. So a reduction in rodents that end up preying on songbird nests, that could directly benefit songbirds if the rodents actually are a significant predator of the nest. And this holds true for all the other potential predators. And so what we really need in order to assess that will be 3 lines of evidence. And we're collecting all of this with this study. So 3 types of data. The first is to be able to actually identify the predators on the nest, who's actually eating the nest, right? That's number 1. Then we want to see, of those different species that are eating the nest, are the cows or the effect of grazing affecting them? And then we would actually really want to link, does a change in activity of those predators, does that lead to an actual change in nest success or not? And so that's kind of just a teaser for what we're working on next and what you can expect from us next after we wrap up this publication. And it's why we placed those cameras on the nest. You might have been wondering, why did we have cameras out there? And they were to help us correctly identify if the nest succeeded or not for these analyses, but also told us who was actually eating the chicks. So here are just a couple action shots, kind of fun. We have birds like kestrels eating our chicks, ravens, snakes are really into the eggs. So for now, it's been really fun clicking through and learning what's been eating our songbirds. And I really look forward to diving into the future. And with that, I think I'm around 40 minutes, but does it sound like I might have time for questions, Juliana?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Vanessa. Very amazing presentation. I really like the good for the birds, good for the herd. Very cool. And my take here is so far we see that there's a lot of harmony, right, between those species and grazing so far. At least that's my interpretation of the data. Well, thank you very much. Let me see if we have any questions here. I have a few comments. Let me go back. I do have a question here. So regarding your grazing utilization, can you discuss a little bit more on the method you use to evaluate grazing utilization?
Yeah, sure. So this is unexpectedly a sticky topic when I started diving into it. So people like to quantify grazing in a lot of different ways. And so we actually tried 3 or 4 different ways for this project. We thought we're going to be as quantitative as possible. We're going to put grazing exposures on the landscape. We put what was a really high density of grazing exposures, so 1 per acre. So it was 15 to 20 per pasture. So if you're trying to do that as a rancher and you have a 2,000 acre pasture, that would be insane, right? And it turns out that clipping those grazing exposures, those 1 meter squared grazing exposures, was not enough to capture the variability. So our numbers were just, they weren't reliable. We also tried height weight curves, but because we have so much variability out there on the ecosystem, they weren't telling us very much at all. So we ended up going with the landscape appearance method, even though it's qualitative and visual, because it was the best way to get what we felt was the most accurate picture for grazing across our landscape.
Okay, that's very good. We don't really have more questions here. So I think Vanessa's email is right here. So if you guys have any other questions, I think you can send those questions directly to her or to me later, and I'll be happy to forward it. I know if I would just call it, see if there's any other questions for Fernanda. I think same thing, you guys can either reach out to me and I'll forward those questions to her, and if not, or just email her directly. So I think that's what we had for tonight. And before we turn off, I would like to go ahead and do our draw of prize. So Fernanda, if you can give me a number. And Vanessa, if you can stop sharing your screen, I think that would be easier. Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Then a number between
0 and 9.
0 and 9. 9.
Yeah. Oh, actually, no. We only have 35 people. So 0 and 3.
3.
Okay. Vanessa, 0 and 9.
1.
1. So person 31 on my list here. Let me see. Actually, we just lost it. No. Oh. It's the very last person on the list. It's Stone and Louis Platt. So let me send you a text here. Please send me your email. If you can send me your email, I'll reach out soon, and then we can do the arrangements for the gift card. And if you don't send me your email right now, I do have your email on the list, so I'll figure out a way to. Oh, there you go. Oh, Fernanda email. But yeah, send it to me and I'll reach out to you guys so we can forward this gift card. So I think with that, I'll just thank our speakers. Thank you very much, Fernanda and Vanessa. I really appreciate your time. Thank you, Gracia, for your support. I think it was great. And we'll be here again tomorrow at the same time. Everything will be the same. And we're going to have, let me see, Virginia and Carla tomorrow. Virginia will be talking about trace minerals for beef cattle. And Carla will be talking a little bit of reproductive technologies for beef cattle. So I hope to see you guys tomorrow. And that's it. Thank you all. Thank you, girls. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for organizing, Juliana.
Welcome. Thank you.
Good night to everyone.